microphone's acting up, but I think I have a big enough mouth to at least get through tonight. A number of years ago, I'd been involved in studying Hebrew prior to my first operational assignment in the Navy. And Diane and I were flying home on a short visit back home. And while we were on the flight, we met a lady who was coming back to the States from Israel, where she had been visiting family. Her husband had been killed during the Six-Day War. And we struck up a conversation on the plane. In fact, it was such a good conversation that we then became friends for the next 40 years. When we got home, this lady, Gira was her name, invited us to Passover with her and her family. So we came to their apartment and we began the Passover ritual together. And at one point, Gira offered me the book and said, "Would you care to read some of the prayers?" Oh, a little scary moment for the new Hebrew scholar here. But I took the book and I read the prayers. And about halfway through the prayers, this lady took the book away from me, went to her son, who was about 18, 19, and said, "Even the goy reads better than you." The last person they expected in their household to read Hebrew better than one of them was a goy, someone from the outside. I think about that as I read the gospel tonight, because think about where we have been, the journey we have been on over these last number of weeks. How many times has Father Roy or I said, "Did you hear in the gospel? The disciples just didn't get it. They didn't get it. The questions they're asking, the things they're doing, they don't get what Jesus is all about. His own disciples don't get it." Tonight, we get somebody who's usually listed among the villains of the piece, the scribes and the Pharisees. Tonight, it's a scribe who comes up. And you almost have to wonder, I wonder if this is a trick question, that a scribe, a lawyer, would come up and ask Jesus, "What's the first of all the commandments?" Now, I'm sure if I ask everybody here, I'd say, "What are the commandments?" And you could list all 10, right? Sure. You got it? The trouble is that in Jesus' day, the Pharisees and the scribes had added to the list. And at the time this conversation is taking place, there are literally 613 commandments. So the lawyer's not asking a simple question here. He's asking a very complex and a very subtle question. Jesus, where do you put your priorities? How do you understand how we are to live if we are followers of Almighty God, the one who rules the earth? Jesus doesn't hesitate. And the first part of his answer is an answer that any Jewish person would give. You heard it read out in its original form in the first reading from Deuteronomy. That's the law. The Lord our God is one. Hear, O Israel. Shema, O Israel. That is a prayer that Jews to this day say at least 3 times a day. So when Jesus begins his answer, it's what they're expecting. But then he adds the twist. How many commandments did the scribe ask him to talk about? Number 1. Jesus throws in 2 more. I know the book says a second one. I'm saying a third one. I'll explain in a minute. But Jesus throws in something else. He said, in addition to loving God with your whole mind and heart and soul and strength, love your neighbor. Whoa. And we know from other teachings of Christ that when he says neighbor, he doesn't just mean the person living next door. He means people like the Samaritan. He means people that good Jews would not associate with. People that they would rather walk for days around their country than have anything to do with them. And Jesus says they're neighbor too. In fact, they can be better neighbor to you than some of our own people. So, if you're going to love God, you must love neighbor. Then he throws an even bigger twist in at the very end. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's why I say I think there's 3 things he's putting together. But what he's telling the lawyer is these aren't three separate things. This is all part of a single commandment to love. With everything we have, with all that we are, to love. First and foremost, God. But what Jesus is saying is, you can't just sit there and say, I love God, and not love neighbor. And not love that neighbor as we would love ourselves. Think about that. We are to love with our whole mind, soul, heart, and strength. This is the time to start asking ourselves, as we come to the end of ordinary time, this time of discipleship training, how do I love God? Do I love God? What's my relationship with God like? Oh, sure, we all want to obey God. We all fear God. But do I really love God with all of my heart and mind and soul and strength? This isn't about what we do on Sundays. This is a way of life. If we love someone else, it consumes us. It's who we are, not just something that we do on occasion. And that loving neighbor, as I said before, is tied directly to the love of God. You can't say you love God and then ignore the neighbor. You cannot. As we make decisions in life, we cannot ignore neighbor. And that extended sense of who neighbor is that Jesus challenges us with. It's easy to be neighbor to the people we like. It's much, much harder to be neighbor to people who hate us, who despise us, who we don't feel comfortable around. And Jesus says your love of God is measured by how well you love all neighbors. And then there's that last bit. Today, how often do we hear of people who are so consumed with their own self-doubt, with their own self-loathing, over mistakes they've made, over things they've done, over sins they've committed. How many times I've had young people come up to me. I had one young woman a number of years ago come up to me and say, but Deacon, what hope is there for me? I've committed the unforgivable sin of abortion. What hope is there for me? How could this young person ever hope to love neighbor and to love God if she didn't first love herself and come to forgive herself and to seek forgiveness from God? It's all tied together. You can't have one without the other. So my sisters and brothers, disciples of God, let's take this chance as we continue with the Mass and as we are fed with the body and blood of Christ, and as we live out this next week, let's ask ourselves, do I truly love God? Heart, mind, soul, strength, everything I am. Is it about the love of God? And do I live that love in my love and care and concern for neighbor? And am I taking care of myself as well? Not because I'm worthy of it, but because I too am a creature of God. That's our challenge. It's all about love. Love. Love.